Um, Thank you so much for joining us. Those who are on Facebook, I want to apologize for the delay. We had a little bit of technical issues, um, but we're ready. We are on fire and we're ready to have an interesting discussion. We have a great panelists who are joining us, and so feel free to leave comments on our Facebook, share this events with your friends and family. This is an important discussion. And so thank you for joining us. This is a great evening where we have an important discussion that focuses on the intersection between race and criminal justice. And this event is taking place on a historical day, Juneteenth. And this is the day that when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, and took control of the state and ensured that all enslaved people were freed. And so this day honors the end to slavery in the United States and is considered the longest running African American holiday. If this would have been a typical day, we would have had a film screening and a panel discussion at the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. And fortunately now we live in a period where there's COVID-19. We want to ensure that the community we serve is staying safe and the staff at Esperanza are also staying safe as well. The reason why the Esperanza has taken the initiative to have this important discussion is tied into the history of the work that we do. And in the early years, the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center has engaged in demonstrations against the KKK, the caravans, organized the caravans to Central America and organized the first art exhibit in Texas to focus on the queer community and the AIDS crisis. So our cultural and arts programming plays a vital role in bringing together diverse communities and building solidarity among diverse groups. And so we are gathered here, hinged upon our work as an organization and the deep root concern that we have for our community and other organizations as well, who also, fight for justice and peace and ensure that we live in a community where we uphold what we think is genuinely human right and human dignity of all citizens. And so with this event, one thing we wanted to make sure is that we recognize the names of the folks that we've lost due to police violence. And we recognize that there's so many names and we cannot mention each one of them right now due to time constraints. So I will just mention a few names to just honor the lives of those who we've lost during this period. And I just want us to take a minute to, as I say their names, to kind of reflect and, think about what we need to see change. Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, Marquise Jones, Charles Chop Roundtree, Anthony Scott, Norman Cooper, Justin Howell, Dominique Remy Phelps, Rhea Melton. We will also mention Oluwatoyin Salau. Let's take a moment of silence as we remember those whom we've lost. Thank you. In the next segment of this panel discussion, I would like to introduce our moderator, Professor Carla Brothers. She is the president of Commonwealth Computer Company and the project coordinator for African American Studies. We are thankful that she is going to moderate this discussion, and I would like to extend my gratefulness for her, taking the time to agree to do this, even though we reached out to her. I know she's been busy with a lot of events, but you've taken the time to be here, and you've agreed to moderate this discussion. I would like to usher this segment or this part of this panel discussion to you so that you can briefly talk about your reflections from the film, and then after that, introduce the panelists.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to have this opportunity to be with you all on this Juneteenth Jubilee Day. This day means a lot, and for me, it has a lot of meanings that go beyond what we seem to learn about in our textbooks. When you consider the 13th movie, we need to understand that it's talking about the 13th Amendment in the US Constitution and how slavery was abolished. But we need to understand that when slavery was abolished, it wasn't ended. It did not end right then and there. And for those slaveholders that were busy laying their crops, they made sure, even in Texas during that time period, that they didn't tell some of those slaves that they were free until after they got the economic benefits from them. And that economic benefit was also talked about in the 13th video. I think it's very, very important that people pay attention to the part of the 13th Amendment that says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist. I don't think a lot of times we take time to think about that and everything that was in that video. Because if we did, we would have already thought about, everybody that's going to jail won't be able to vote. And I think that if people just right now paid attention, it was just this week that Snoop Doggy Dogg said, I'm getting ready to have the first time ever to be able to vote because they expunged my record. Well, Snoop Doggy Dogg has lots of money to pay for all of that to occur. What's happening to all these other young people that are going to jail that can't pay an attorney to help fight for their records to get expunged so that they can go vote? I think we need to tie a lot of what was in that video with the Black Lives Matter movement, because there are a lot of connections that go along with that movie that are in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I just hope that when people maybe go look at it a second time, that they connect those values of the Black Lives Movement with what they're seeing on the screen in the video. Because Black villages, collective values, globalization, diversity, all of that is brought out in that video. So we need to, I guess, broaden our thoughts about what they told us about. With all of that, let me ask each of our panelists to tell us a little snippet about yourselves. I could add to each one of you, I guess, already. just because of the relationships from the past. Camille, you're a lady. We'll have you go ladies first. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and don't forget to unmute your mic.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Camille Factory. I graduated from UTSA this past fall with a degree in political science, a Bachelor of Arts in political science with a minor in legal studies. At UTSA, I founded the movement #Change Rape Culture, where I fought for survivors of sexual assault and violence, and I challenged Title IX policies on campus. And I made sure that there was accurate survival representation. From there, I was the assistant editor at the Paisano Independent School newspaper. I was a national contender on the UTSA debate team. And I also organized grassroots for Gina Ortiz Jones, Julian Castro, Beto O'Rourke in Turnhout, Texas. And so my main focus is voter strategy, voter turnout, and what that looks like for marginalized communities. But just recently, I helped spearhead the #Justice for Floyd protests in San Antonio and kicked that conversation off. And it's just been a beautiful, beautiful ride. But it's also been bittersweet because of the circumstance. So that's just a little bit about me, #Change Rape Culture. And yeah, I'm out here.
Thank you so much. Jonathan, give us a little snippet about you.
Yeah, so as mentioned, my name is Jonathan David Jones, and I'm just going to read a little bit from my bio here, so that's what you see. But I could say I've been a Black Lives Matter organizer since around 2015. I started off in, I would say, ministry and poetry at UTSA, where I studied sociology, and kind of found myself thrusted into the forefront of a movement at a very young age. And from there, I spearheaded a lot of rallies, played a key role in the removal of the Confederate monument in Travis Park with a lot of help from the city in downtown San Antonio. Co-led efforts with someone I will always consider a brother, Mike Lowe, for police reform in San Antonio. Appeared on a lot of news stations, KENS 5, KSAT, Fox News, CNN, and many more. Written a few articles as well, centered around grassroots organizing and racial climate. And I've taught a lot of workshops as well, ranging from how to be an ally to Black lives and translating anger into power that facilitates tangible change. So I would say just largely known as just the ability to unite intersectional perspectives, whether that be through grassroots movement, businesses, city officials, or public interest commitment to social issues. And so now I'm actually living in Houston, Texas, where I'm just lending my support in the best way I can, and providing my experience and some of the wisdom I gained from organizing since 2015 to kind of inspire that change in the young leaders that we see today.
Thank you. And last but not least, Tommy Calvert.
Thank you, Professor. Of course, I've known you since I was probably crawling around on the floor at IBM with my mother and your family. And I have been a part of the Esperanza Peace and Justice family for probably 25 years because I grew up with a civil rights family. My father is an organizer, and I'm an organizer as well. And so he was one of the main bridge builders between the Black community and the Latino community, the Black community, the LGBT community. And so I took that experience and went to Tufts University and did international relations and economics, and president of the NAACP chapter there, political director of the Pan-African Alliance, served on the board of trustees for several years and raised a lot of hell over diversity issues while in college. While in college, became, shortly after I graduated, I should say, I was asked to be the head of the American Anti-Slavery Group, which was a human rights organization, the first anti-slavery organization founded in America since Reconstruction. And I became the youngest director of an international major human rights organization in the world, and helped to stand up two of the world's newest countries, South Sudan and Burma, and helped to make the issue of human trafficking a household name. Did public relations and public affairs, helped start a radio station in San Antonio, KROV, And then on a prayer and a sign, I ran for county commissioner. And so that's the short end of that story.
Thank you, Tommy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the questions. I'm going to ask each one of you to give me a brief response so that we can get through as many of these questions as possible. Then we're going to open it up to the audience to ask you all questions or add their comments if they would like. Let's start off with knowing that the other thing that the film is bringing out is that 25% of the people in this world are incarcerated or have been. I know all of you have your angel wings on, but have you ever been affected by any of the themes, other themes of this particular film? Have they impacted you in some sort of way? Jonathan, you look like you're ready to answer.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in. I mean, the large overarching theme of the film, it's obviously we're talking about criminal justice and the mass incarceration. But some of the things it talks about is imagery. And that's just major. I think it plays a role in honestly all of our lives. But as you mentioned, we have our angel wings on right now, but you know, I haven't always been as polished as I am myself. And I grew up not nearly as eloquent in speech and all of that as I am now. And so I've experienced firsthand someone approaching you because you looked a certain way, an officer approaching you because you looked a certain way, and it playing a huge role in you feeling like you're maybe one or two wrong words away from becoming another statistic, right? Being a part of that incarceration, that 25% that's of the entire world that's actually in jail right now. So that's where it's definitely played an impact in my life. And because I have friends, you know, I have people that I grew up with that I know that are in prison at this very moment. You know, you feel so directly connected. You feel like you were just one day, maybe one good day, one bad day, one good decision away from being incarcerated for a very long time. I think we all, I wouldn't say we all, but a lot of people can say they've committed crimes that they just got away with. And unfortunately, some people didn't. And being the nature of being a Black person in America is you not getting away with it can mean, can be a lot more detrimental to your life than it could be for, say, a white person, right? From the difference of 5 to 20 years, right? So, so that's where it's directly impacted my life because I currently have friends that I know are incarcerated right now. I feel like I said, one wrong word, that could be me, right? Even recently at rallies, right, where you have officers kind of targeting you, you know, so that's where I would say that some of the things have impacted me.
Thanks, Jonathan. Camilla.
Aside from, you know, just, I think everything about that film applies to Black folk. It's really hard to say that it doesn't affect you, even if it's not an immediate effect. But what I can say is that I have a brother, he's 25, or he's 5 years older than me. And I remember not vaguely, actually very vividly, if his phone would die when I was, you know, younger and I was going to bed, I remember my mom in distress calling him over and over and over again. And I grew up in a really red county, Williamson County. And they are known for what Black people say, they'll lock you up and throw away the key. And so I just remember my mom calling him over and over again, crying, you know, if his phone would die, if he wasn't home before the street lights are on, you know, that's a thing for Black people. That's a very normal thing for, I feel like, Black parents to tell their children, or to be home before the lights are on. But I don't feel like we often attribute that to sundown towns and laws where Black folk can be lynched and killed legally once the sun goes down. So, but anywho, very vividly, I do remember my first interactions with that just being my brother's phone dying and my mom calling every hospital, calling, you know, everybody that she could to make sure that her son wasn't dead. And it's sad because, you know, compared to that experience of a person of color or a white person in America, I would wonder how their parents would feel if they didn't answer their own. So that was what immediately stuck out to me. Was, you know, that interaction with race at the age that I was. And just being like, dude, charge your phone. Don't stress mom out, you know? But it's sad because she nonetheless always has to stress. And so, yeah, that's how it directly related to me.
Thank you. Tommy.
You know, Camilla and Jonathan are both right. Every single thing about the movie has affected my life. I want to say, as someone who has to execute laws, every word of the 13th Amendment was chosen with intent, and the intent was white supremacy. So the first memory I have of white supremacy is when I went to kindergarten, and I went to a private school. I was a year younger than most of the kids because my mother started me, well, she felt I was ready. Most kids were 6 and I was 5. And let me rewind a little bit. I was the top student in the class, and my kindergarten teacher wanted to hold me back. And this is when she met with my mother at the parent-child conference. She said that, I'm going to hold Tommy back. My mother said, why? He's made all excellent scores on his test. I have them all. She said, well, because he's younger than everybody else, when he goes to public school and when he plays football, I want him to be as big and as strong as the other boys in his class. And so my mother explained to me at that point, Tommy, you're going to have to be twice as good as whites in order to be perceived as equal. And I've had to live that burden, like many African Americans in professional life and in life have had to live that burden. Of course, I remember my first instance with law enforcement was around my sister, who was given a disproportionate sentence. She did a tough crime, but she served 11 years and 9 months in a Texas prison. And so going through the justice system and visiting her in prison, seeing one day a guard plant a knife on my mother's car, and you know how absolutely frantic. I knew my mother had never had any kind of knife or anything in the trunk. And then as a teenage boy, camping out for Spurs tickets the first time we went to the finals in 1999, I was driving my dad's Cadillac, this classic Fleetwood Brougham everybody knows him for. And I went back to get some Cheetos or something because we were camping out at Fort Sam Houston because they had the last, this was when the gates were open, and they had the last tickets for the finals. And I knew to check the tail light before I left to make sure that the tail lights were working, because I was working with the ACLU at the time. And that was one of the common profiling things that law enforcement does to stop blacks, to ask them and profile. And so sure enough, I was driving the speed limit under 20 at Fort Sam Houston. And all of a sudden, all these cop cars come, they pull me over, and the officer tells me that my tail light is out. And I didn't know at the time that I needed to say, officer, show me the defect. I later learned that from my friends at the ACLU. But, you know, there are so many things that this movie provides so much clarity for this moment in time and this moment in history. And it should give all of us the extra energy we need and the extra outline that we need to make sure that the ladder of opportunity doesn't just trim around the edges, but makes fundamental structural change. And I hope that this movie will be seen by a broader audience.
Thank you, Tommy. The film emphasizes the current crisis of mass incarceration. As Angela Davis points out in the film, historically, when one looks at efforts to create reforms, they inadvertently lead to more repression. How can we be more vigilant about institutional racism? Camille, would you like to start?
Yes, institutions are my quote unquote expertise, huh? First of all, Angela Davis is my inspiration. I love everything that she stands for. Sada Shakur as well. The Black women at the forefront of the movement have definitely made some change. I will also say that what a lot of people tell me, radicalism, and what I think is radical is a human right. I don't necessarily equate being vigilant with being complicit. And I think that the only way to really challenge institutional racism is to call it out. And that's what I did at UTSA, regardless of how many eyes rolled when my hand went up, regardless of how many complaints I got because my bullhorn was loud. We saw changes at the institution in less than a year. And so I think that the best way is to really take it head on. And to also be very critical about these conversations that we have about inclusivity and equity. What do those things mean? And how do we not drown out the Black voices that are at the forefront of the movement whenever we have these conversations? Because oftentimes Black folk the lines get blurred when we get identified as POC. I mean, I feel like that's also a very important thing to differentiate when we talk about people of color and Black people, because people of color don't necessarily have the same experience in America that Black folk have had, the gratuitous violence that has been done to the Black body, the origins of the slave trade, racial rape, the way that slaves were made to rape each other for racial capital. And so I think that it's very, very important to make these distinctions when we talk about institutional racism, not only to directly call it out, but to also really give credence to the struggle, the Black struggle. And I saw a post that Jonathan had posted, give Black women the mic, give Black women the mic sometimes, if not, a good amount of times, but that's my answer.
Now, I'm not gonna not giving Black women the mic now. I'm for that. But Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, well, I love everything she said. I mean, I'm over here snapping because, I mean, as I mentioned in my post, when it comes to giving Black women the mic, and I know this is only slightly off topic, but when we talk about the institution of racism, we can't ignore racism in relation it plays to oppression to all kinds of people, and there's two dynamics here when we talk about the institution of racism. It's a relationship that we can't ignore, and I think we have for a very long time. So where you have white women who are obviously women who could feel oppressed under sexism, but could still benefit from racism, right? And then you have Black men, right? The reality is that we are also oppressed, right? And we see a lot of violence. We experience the disadvantage of racism, but men also benefit from sexism. Right, and so you have two power structures that, when you look back at our history, that have always played a role. And so that's why I say, yeah, give Black women the mic, because when you're trying to center the impacted, you can't have the overarching voice of a movement be somebody that benefits from one of these structures. And again, we cannot divorce the relationship between sexism and racism at all. So, on topic with the question, when you say historically, I love what Angela Davis says when she points out in the film, historically, when one looks at the efforts to create reforms, they inadvertently lead to more repression. And that R word is huge, reforms, because since the death of Trayvon Martin, that has been the center of conversation for police forces. Reform, more trainings, and you still see people kind of repeating that same language. We just need more reform, we need more trainings. I think about SAPD, who has currently cultural bias trainings. They do it once every 4 years, which I just find absurd, because that's enough time for somebody to have started and finished college. They have mental health training, right? But trainings have proven, when you look at the science behind it, to be more expensive for cities and less effective, right? Police force and trainings, I would argue there is no relationship between safety. It just costs a lot of money, and it doesn't do anything. And to relate that to now, Minneapolis PD, who was obviously we recognize as the police department that murdered George Floyd, they actually were one of the progressive leaders on police reform since 2016. And yet here we are, we still have George Floyd. So when it comes to what Angela Davis is talking about, these efforts for reform, we have to divorce that word, I'm sorry. Reform. We got to stop approaching things with this mentality that, oh, maybe if we just change their behavior. This system has been a problem from jump. When we talk about the very first police, I mean, there was 2 police forces that were implemented. In the North, they used what we call neighborhood watch, where members of the community were kind of like appointed pretty much to watch their neighborhoods. And problem with that was the neighborhood watch people were raping people and doing crazy stuff during their watch. And then you had the South, slave patrol, which we're all familiar with. And that is the system that unfortunately America decided to stick with, even since the Emancipation Proclamation, as the documentary 13 talks about. So when you're talking about being vigilant about attacking this institution of racism, Camille was talking about something about radicalism, and it's unfortunate that we have to attach the word radical with it, because that already brings a negative connotation. When you bring that to the table, people are already kind of like ruling you off there. But we have to reimagine the way that we have looked at things. And I think, and I want to choose my words carefully here, when we think about the civil rights movement, I think that was one of the marks that unfortunately, I wouldn't say that we missed, but it's something that we've learned from today, right? Where it was this effort for reform, but it's got us here, you know, where they did the reform and they listened to a lot of the things that people recommended, but we're still here. So I think we have to completely reimagine our institutions as a whole, reimagine education, reimagine public safety, more directly with related to the film and the discussion. We have to completely reimagine that. Like, maybe we don't need police, as crazy as that sounds. Maybe we have to completely reimagine what we need in our society when it comes to oversight and protection.
Tommy, do you want to comment, please?
Yeah, ask me the question one more time. I've been enraptured in these answers. I want to make sure I answer the right question. Yeah.
In the film, this film emphasizes the current crisis of mass incarceration. As Angela Davis points out in the film, historically, one looks at efforts to create reforms. They inadvertently lead to more repression. How can we be more vigilant about institutional racism?
Yeah, so here's the deal. Here's what I would say. We are rarely going to get full transformation overnight, but we, the citizenry, have to empower ourselves to understand the tools that are being, and the tricks of politics that are being used against our community. So you take the 13th Amendment, the way that they intertwine that, those folks writing the 13th Amendment knew they were going to use the institution of criminal justice to disenfranchise Black people, but Black people just found it out recently, okay? And so they knew that going in. If we are prepared at the negotiating table to ensure that the law is carved out and the change and the transformation is carved out in a way that answers our highest ideals, then we too can ensure that we don't digress. Now, let's get really specific. We have in San Antonio, SAP has the most people who have died in police custody in the United States between the years 2005 and 2015. It's covered up. Nobody talks about it. How does that exist in San Antonio, Texas, and everybody thinks San Antonio is immune from these issues? Everybody thinks that happens in another city when we're the worst. We also, according to the Washington Post, have had more police who were fired for abuses and rehired, 68%, nearly 70%, including a police officer who gave a homeless man feces was rehired in the San Antonio Police Department. How does that stuff happen in San Antonio? Well, you have to remember that white supremacy, okay, is going to try to put a veneer of civility. They're going to keep things out of the Express News, off of KSAT 12, out of the press, away, you know, no body cameras. I had to fight like heck to get body cameras at the Bexar County Sheriff's Department. So we have to be aware of the historical continuum of white supremacy and how it manifests itself, and elevate ourselves to change the tactics, which I see in this new young movement. And I really applaud, because just like ALEC and some of these other conservative forces, you know, made money off the ankle bracelets and just found a way to make money off of new stuff, we have to be more innovative, and we have to be like chess players and thinking 4, 5, 6, 10 steps down the road to prevent the reforms we want from happening. I mean, from falling in the wrong direction. Last year at the Bexar County budget season, I noticed we had 140 sheriff's deputies who were not hired, and they still wanted to give 10 additional spots to the sheriff's department. I said, why would we do that when they can't hire the 140 they have? This year, it's 200 officers are vacant at the sheriff's department. And so I have brought to the leadership of those protesting the fact that I said, I need y'all to come into my budget and help me out here, because without your public pressure, I could take, for example, why not take, if the sheriff has never hired more than 75 people in a year, he's got 200 vacancies, why not take the 125 positions and put that to assisted living for the mentally ill, housing for the mentally ill? They're 20 to 35% of the jail at any given day. There's all kinds of confrontations. There's all kinds of shootings and escalations that happen because law enforcement is dealing with that, and they're not equipped. They're in some cases traumatized just by being out on the force. So those are things that can be done if we're working together. But certainly it is the role of having kind of all the pieces of the puzzle that sometimes has let us be fooled in some of the good changes we've had not being exactly where we should as a society.
And let me point out to you all, reform is no better than the person who's doing the reforming. If you're not a very good teacher, how am I going to teach you to reform?
Yeah, exactly.
So please think about that when you're thinking of reforming. A lot of times we tend to forget that a lot of the information that kids learn, they learn before school begins. So if I'm learning to repress people, I've generally learned it before I even made it to kindergarten. Our next question. In the film, we see how Black people have been characterized as criminals and dehumanized, especially in the media. How is positive visibility representation important? Tommy, I'm gonna start with you because I've let you be last each time.
All good. I'm enjoying the real leadership on this issue and hearing from them. You know, the Express News and most of the mainstream press almost pretend like I don't exist, even though I do twice as much as my colleagues and get a lot of things done. And that's also by design. To have an African-American young man be able to step into that position without really owing the white establishment anything is a threat. It is a threat to the imagery that they want to portray of what Black leadership can lead. And so the portrayal of our community in all positions is not just symbolic, it can be inspirational to a whole new generation that need inspiration in spite of all the obstacles put before them. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but ask me the question one more time. I'll tie it up and let them handle it. It's a long week. Sorry, guys. I've been working. Oh, you're on mute, Carla.
In the film, we see how Black people have been characterized as criminals and dehumanized, especially in the media. How is positive visible representation important? And whether you give yourself credit for that, Tommy, you were discussing it.
Well, we have to learn. This is Professor Salas taught me this. You know, he said, you know, we're 99% genetically the same, and there is but one race, the human race. And we have to learn as a human rights leader. I have been in South Sudan in the war zone. I traveled there, freed 6,000 slaves, and I heard how the government, the dictatorship in Sudan, used radio to get the mujahideen, the jihadists to raid black villages because they quoted scriptures in the Quran which said that when you are in a holy war, you can enslave your enemies. I've seen how media has been used to kill and ethnically cleanse. And of course, our ancestors in America have been the recipient of it. And obviously, you know, we've all been, many of us have been in an elevator where someone clutches their purse or locks their door because they think we are, just by walking the face of the earth, going to steal from them or kill them or whatever. And so the humanization of all of us and understanding that we all want to live freely is really paramount. And if we don't do that, then the kind of race war that we are in, I believe we are in a race war as we speak, led by our president and a lot of enablers, it will win. So we have to do our job of loving each other and humanizing each other. It's very important.
Jonathan, would you like to answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many layers to this when it comes to imaging. One of the things that the movie 13th points out is how white America portrayed us completely changed. So when we were slaves, it was, we're happy-go-lucky. We're happy to be in the position that we are. All of the ads and flyers and things like that was of dancing Black people, a lot of music, things like that. Emancipation Proclamation happens, and then slaves are now free. Now all of a sudden these ads have completely switched, and now they're portraying Black people as aggressive, animalistic, you know, dangerous people. And then the major film that, I mean, one of the first films was Birth of a Nation, right? That 13th mentions, and it was this white man playing a Black person in blackface, and you see this situation where this Black man is just hounding after this white woman, and she's just so afraid to be raped by this Black man that she jumps off a cliff because, you know, she'd rather die than have sexual intercourse with a Black man. And then you see the KKK, right, in this film, and they're like chasing this Black man down, and they're portrayed as these heroes. The film pointed out how the KKK actually wasn't even a popular group before this film. You know, and a lot of the practices like the burning of the cross, that wasn't even something that the KKK did until after the film. And so you see the direct impact that the arts can have on an entire culture. It was following this film that the entire attitude towards Black people in the country changed. Obviously, they were racist as they could be, so they're already seen as beneath them in the first place. But Birth of a Nation just kind of changed the rhetoric. Right, it was just like we have to go get them. They're this vile. They're a ticking time bomb. They're just crime walking. Right. So that's our first experience of imagery, right? And the impact that it has on a society. And so you continue this trend from this time all the way until today, where you have instances where, like Mike Brown, how, you know, as young as he was, media is portraying him as a grown man, and then you have. And I forget the young white man's name from Baylor, who had raped, who had sexually assaulted, you know, these women while they were unconscious, and he got like 7 months in prison. But the whole language behind him is he's the disenfranchised youth, right? Older than Mike Brown was at the time that case was happening, but Mike Brown is being portrayed as this man. They kept saying this man, Black man, so they portray him as like this hulking, dangerous figure. Young as he was. Same with Trayvon Martin. I mean, they tried to describe this very young boy who like he was trained in MMA. He was doing all, and so like it's imagery, right? And it plays a huge role in things like sentencing. You know, general public opinion. We see firsthand, even right now, what public pressure can do and have the impact that can have on cases and things like that, as we're seeing nationwide protests, right? And how all of a sudden, for the first time, these courts and things like that, we're arresting these officers immediately and things like that. Well, nobody wants their city torn up, pretty much. It's kind of what's happening right now. So we got to respond really, really quick. So imagery, it just plays such a huge role. It plays such a huge role, and so positive imagery is very important. And I'm grateful, obviously, we have so many more Black leads in TV shows and things like that. And that comes with its own layer of issues, right? Kerry Washington with Scandal, right? And it's like she's a strong Black lead, but yet at the same time, there has to be the stigma attached, right? The mistress or something like that, right? So it's like, even now, it's almost like we still can't be sold as just a powerful Black lead all on its own, right? Until we get moved.
I hate to cut you short, Jonathan, but we're getting ready to be close to opening it up. Camille, you want to say something real quick to that question, and then we need to open it up to allow our audience to ask questions.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm past the point of giving a damn, especially as a Black woman. The angry Black woman trope is just worn out for me. You have Venus and Serena Williams, who are still chastised despite their accomplishments. You have Michelle Obama, who was called a monkey in the White House and being the first lady of the United States. So the crux of my study is Black feminine rage and how beautiful that is. And so I really feel like I don't really care what the media has to depict about me if I know that I'm fighting for something that's worth fighting for, especially if I'm valid in my rage and if I'm valid in my fight. I think that despite the hoops that we jump through, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. And so I don't care. I let the cameras get in my face. I let them see me be angry. I let them see me be rageful because I am warranted in that rage. And I think that Black people, we have to own that and we have to accept that. And I think that trying to reach these positive aspirations of media and how we're depicted is just going to be redundant, and it's going to be us chasing our tails. I think that we need to keep our eye on the prize, and our eye on the prize is the warrant to our rage.
You're on mute, Ms. Carter.
Thank you. Emgar, do we have some questions for the panel?
I know we've left out a couple of questions. There's one question that I think we still have a little bit of time to tackle. And this has to do something that we brought up earlier today. How do you organize during a pandemic? And how do we take care of our health in the process? And I would like to start with you, Kimir, if that's okay.
How you organize during a pandemic? Well, first you have to make the differentiation between a pandemic and Black lives. And that was what I was stuck with when I saw that video of George Floyd and I mourned his death for days. And I got pissed off. And my Twitter fingers, they think for me sometimes. And with that, I said, bring a mask, wear a mask throughout the entire march. Not only did I make sure that people were hydrated, that the community came together and donated supplies, but I also made sure throughout the entire march to tell everybody, hey, we're still in a pandemic. Let's stay 6 feet apart. We can fight for justice, but we can also be safe at the same time. And in a lot of shots of me, I will have my mask off, but it's because it's really hard to scream through a bullhorn and not, get suffocated. But organizing during a pandemic is a lot of responsibility. It's reinforcing the idea that we are in a pandemic, but also reinforcing the necessity for justice. And so all I can say is just to be responsible about that and to be a role model. If you know that there are a lot of cameras out and you're organizing or you're protesting, wear your mask, because people who are criticizing the movement and blaming protesters for the spread of COVID, that gives them more leverage when they see you not wearing a mask, despite the fact that there are studies that say that protesters have not contributed to the spread of COVID in San Antonio. But it's just being vigilant. Mentally, I'm working on that. Today, Jonathan gave some really, really wise feedback on just what it's like to organize. I am 21. And while I want to do 21-year-old things, I still have this cloud of vengeance, looming over my head. And so, despite the fact that vengeance comes with a negative connotation, there was blood spilled for my people, and therefore I won't stop until justice is had for that, despite a pandemic.
Thank you. Tommy was trying, he was ready to answer that. He was
No,
going for it.
I'm glad she answered it first. Really appreciate her insights. Everything was spot on. One thing I would say going forward in terms of the organizing for us to take the protests to progress and change is the recognition that there can be crowd surfing in terms of the finances for the movement. There is a need to create a political action committee. The benefit of going online to raise money in that way is that you can do it nationally, you can do it statewide, and you can really, you got the reforms that are necessary with respect to the union contract in San Antonio could be blocked at the Texas legislative level. So we have to understand that while we're pushing for referendum and things like that, where are the chess pieces that we could get blocked by, and what tools do we need? Sometimes when I was learning about colonialism and the freedom fighters and colonialism, we had a term called appropriating the tools of the master. And sometimes you've got to appropriate the tools that are in front of you and change the game while you reform the game, while you play the game, excuse me, change the game while you play the game. And so there's some aspects of that need to happen going forward. I think as a dude who's in charge of the public health system, I'm obviously very concerned for all of those who are out there and just trying to, everything that we're doing is as American as apple pie, right? So there's nothing wrong with having the Zoom calls and the conference calls and kind of limiting our interaction as this thing explodes. But we certainly need to keep the energy up, but we also need to organize on the budgets and make sure that because the budgets are passed in September, but they're formulated right now. And if you're not in the conversation to change those macro policies, then you're just going to be waiting another year before it changes. So I'm opening up the courthouse, I'm opening up the county and the state in some ways for the organizers to come on in, because I need you.
Thank you, Tommy. Jonathan?
Yeah, it's such a interesting topic to try to navigate when it comes to the pandemic versus Black Lives, right? And some of what I say might sound controversial, but I'm just gonna have at it, right? So there's an unfortunate reality right now that we have two crises happening at the same time, right? And I think the disconnect, when you have people blaming protesters and saying you shouldn't be out there doing this, that, and the third, the issue comes with identifying that as a crisis, right? And this issue of Black killings at the hand of police is so dire to so many people that reality is you see a lot of people that just like to hell with it, Yes, there's a pandemic happening right now, but we are fed up. Right, and that's an unfortunate reality. When it comes to organizers, I think what the pandemic does do, though, is it kind of forces us to think outside the box, right? Virtual panels like the one we're on now. How can we maximize our efforts without physically being present, right? It's just kind of forcing a lot of different populations of people to think about organizing completely different. But when you see the riots you see across the country and things like that right now, I think that just comes from, again, people are fed up. And yes, the coronavirus right now is a crisis, but when you see so many people out there fighting and burning things up, quite frankly, it's because they have also registered that as a crisis as well, and so it becomes extremely hard to differentiate. And I say that mostly to say, yes, it's a challenge. And I know there's a lot of people who kind of, I would say, just judge people that are out there still rallying and things like that. But again, I can only attribute to the fact that you do not register how dire this is as they do, because it does not feel like an option. It feels like an unfortunate reality that we have to juggle both, but it does not feel like an option to not be out there, right? So that's an unfortunate reality. So as far as organizing goes, though, we do what we're doing now, right? We try to maximize our efforts the best that we can. But when it's time to put our foot in the ground, we're going to have to put our foot in the ground as well. And that's just the reality of it.
let me,
Sister Carl, can I give a quick alley-oop to the organizers of these marches? When someone talks about COVID and all the things with the march, I think you flip the script on them and say, why hasn't the president, the governor, the county judge, the mayor made testing happen in a day? Why do we have to wait for a week to get our results? And then after that week, someone's been out and about. I mean, I think there are things that are more important to stemming the tide of COVID than just the protesters coming out with their mask on. So a lot of folks are missing the forest for the trees of the governmental response being totally inadequate to combating this, not having enough contact tracers, not having our own domestic supply of testing. Why can't we go to Southwest Research in San Antonio and help to develop the tests if we have to go to Korea or China? Why haven't we gotten our own domestic supply of PPE so our hospitals don't feel tight and our ventilators are there? All of those questions are not being done, and that too has more of an effect on killing our people than marching out for their justice. I guarantee you that.
I just want to say real quick, Tommy, just really quick. I love what you said, because it's what happens with just about every single issue, is where we flip the responsibility on things like safety onto the people that are impacted, right? And it's like all of a sudden the responsibility is just completely removed from the government, who is unequipped to handle this in the first place. It's the same way when you think about police reform and police brutality. And I remember being asked once from then Mayor Ivy Taylor, well, bring me policy recommendations. Well, you're the mayor, right? I'm presenting you the issue. I'm the one that's impacted by this. And all of a sudden you just get to forfeit your job and not come up with policies anymore and things like that. It's the nature of every single issue, right? It's a convenient excuse to invalidate people like protesting and organizing and things like that, where all of a sudden it's your fault. You're the one who's impacted, but now you got to figure out how to fix this.
Yeah, I was on a call earlier today with a bunch of people who make big salaries. I mean, big, powerful people. And all of them said, I'm just here to listen. And I got off the call. I said, you're making $300,000, $400,000 a year, and you ain't got nothing to say about what's going on in race relations in America? I got off the call. I didn't have time for that. Anyway, I'm sorry.
well, I want to bring something around for you all to just even think about in wrapping this around Juneteenth before I hand it over to Mgard. Have you all thought about how on some of the very first Juneteenth celebrations, Black people weren't handed the money to afford for the grounds for the celebrations or to pay for anything? They had just been slaves. But somehow they got together themselves and raised enough money amongst themselves to pay for the land in order to have a lot of the celebrations. They didn't wait for the man, because the man didn't want them to have the celebrations in the first place. That's kind of like what we're getting ready to have to do with our protest. Do we sit back and we wait for the man, or do we do like our forefathers did? They said, oh, you don't want us to celebrate? We'll buy the land ourselves. That's why there's Emancipation Park in Houston. They bought the land themselves. That's why my deceased husband's family has land for this celebration and for our family reunion. They bought it themselves, and they directly came from slaves. So I want to bring that back around to Juneteenth as we're thinking about now exactly what are we going to do? We might want to think about how we can do it ourselves. Mgard.
Yes, thank you so much for steering this discussion. We'll quickly go to the Q&A session. We have a question from Facebook. Tia is asking, what can San Antonio residents do now to support the movement locally? With several organizations being created to respond to the issue of police brutality, which ones do the panelists personally recommend and why? Kimia?
Yes, I'll answer that. So I am in the process of creating something called the Black Freedom Factory. My last name is Factory. Before I answer this question though, Tommy, your rage, period. I love it. I stand that this energy is what we need. You need to lead those calls because the labor that is required of the Black body to come up with this data, to answer these questions, to aid these white people in POC and work that they should have already been doing is not your fight. It's not your issue. They need to figure it out. So lead that call every time. But what I will say is that, the Black Freedom Factory, I hope we can build a coalition. So right now there's a group, there are different groups. There's the Reliable Rebels. There are a number of groups in San Antonio. So that is a very good question. But the Black Freedom Factory is what I hope will be the spearhead of like the Black Lives Matter movement in San Antonio, to where it's like a directory where we can all get in contact with the different organizations, because some Black organizations are focusing on the policy aspect, right? So they're proposing things to city council. Other groups are focusing on like where the funding of the police goes, like the contracts and things like that. I focus on really just rallying the people. And right now I'm working on a street art exhibit for Black Lives Matter in San Antonio as well. So the answer to that is I'm working on it. Please just follow me on social media accounts. And if you can look at www.blackfactoryfreedom.org. And there's a landing page and you can sign up, and soon enough we'll have updates for that.
I know we are pressed on time, and there are a lot of folks who are asking questions on Facebook. What I can ask of our panelists is that, go to our Esperanza Facebook page and answer some of those questions. We're free to do that. There's this question from Amy, and I think this will be our last question for the day. Can we ask, what are we demanding from the city of San Antonio regarding the police department? Kimia, you want to take that?
I want to chime in as well.
Okay.
Okay, I'll say, we're demanding to reopen and reinvestigate the cases of Charles Roundtree, Marquise Jones, and Anthony Scott. We also want to see where the salaries of these police officers are going, seeing that these families deserve reparations for their legal fees, for funeral costs, and anything else that they might have suffered due to the losses of these families. That's the first thing we're asking. We're asking Joe Gonzalez to not be complicit in this. If there is a legal loophole in the 13th Amendment, then certainly there is a legal loophole to reinvestigate these cases based on evidence that he says he cannot review.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan?
Yeah, I love that Camille brought the specifics, because I want to say what we're asking to the city. It's going to sound a little bit more abstract, but it's mostly connected to things I've seen since a few years back. We've seen San Antonio be a city that just kind of sits back in a chair, and it's just not very aggressive, just kind of like a very lackadaisical approach to when it comes to things like justice and reform and things like that. And it started back with the negotiations with the police union back when Ivy Taylor was mayor. And it was like this, well, we just don't want to fight with them no more. And so forget stepping on the community, forget if we're going to step on the community to do it, let's just stop fighting. And quite literally, I think what is being asked of San Antonio between the city and officers and all that, is to wake up and pay attention. Less and less people are going to allow this stuff to slip under our nose. And I remember in City Hall about 3 years ago, I said to Mayor Ivy Taylor, Baltimore did not know they were Baltimore until they were. Ferguson did not know they were Ferguson until they were. And so the more that you make these decisions, that is quite literally, when the contract was passed, it's like quite literally stepping on the throats of the community. You're running the risk of, when you look at the instance with Ferguson, if you look at Ferguson PD, it was not just Mike Brown. Mike Brown was the boiling point, right? It was not just, oh, after Trayvon Martin happened, or after, all these names happened, all of a sudden things just like, oh, this one instance is what made us angry. No, you look through the history of Ferguson PD, that had been constantly oppressing that community. And eventually they got fed up. And so I guess the general thing that you're asking San Antonio to do is wake up, because I feel like there's this general, in my experience, it's just this very lazy approach, when it's just kind of like, we're just going to sit back and wait for somebody to present something to us. And like, I encourage San Antonio to get proactive about fixing this stuff, because the cities are getting tired of it. When you see like LA defunding police. You see other places voting to abolish police. We're done listening to this language of, oh, we can't really do that, because you can't, right? You just have to be willing to, and you need to listen to the people that are talking to you. But you got to get it right, San Antonio. Put frankly, you have to get this right, because people are tired of it.
Let me just quickly add to that, that there is an inherent conflict for every district attorney in prosecuting and looking at cases for law enforcement. They have to work with them every day. All district attorneys, and we should be demanding that they create a special prosecutor or an independent inspector general, rather, or an ombudsman of some sort that has complete independence, that doesn't work with law enforcement every day on the investigations of crimes. That's why they don't want to do it. It's uncomfortable to them. And so what we ought to do is take that institutional nature and take that away and create independent investigative prosecutorial bodies that are separate from the regular day-to-day district attorney's office. So I would say that's something that I'm planting as a seed with many to try and get done, to establish things like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an Innocence Project locally, to determine, you know, who has been falsely convicted of crimes, who has not had crimes prosecuted that were victims of the state, of the city, of their own government. I also think that it is very much, again, needed to look at, you know, how do we look at the issues of affordable housing? One of the main reasons people commit crime is economic instability and poverty, and this is a city that is going more and more into renter status because the cost of living has gotten too high. And so we need to look at how do we, I've been proposing for 5 years, a $100 million housing bond to expand affordable housing. It could include an assisted living facility for folks who have mental illness. All of these things are absolutely possible, as Jonathan just said, if people stop being the walking dead. There's not enough folks who come to my courtroom and raise hell. It does make a difference. You have runoff elections on the commissioner's court happening right now. There should be a forum of the community to find out where the candidates running for commissioner's court, which oversees 3 times as many dollars as the city does. We oversee $6 billion. The city oversees $2 billion. But yet, you know, most of the heat is off of us. I have to keep the heat going. So I welcome people to come and get involved in the budget, looking at all of these issues that are at play. Substance abuse, the war on drugs that's been created. The county is in charge of your substance abuse entity. It's called the Center for Health Care Services. How do we expand residential rehab? How do we expand the counseling? Because we have a 4,000 or 5,000 person decrease. How do we change state law to decriminalize the war on drugs that has created all kinds of disproportionate sentences? So all of those things are things that are on the agenda this second.
Thank you. We have to, at some point, end this discussion, and I hope this is just the beginning so that we can have a series of discussions and have an avenue where we can all talk and follow up and get more engaged and get more connected. I want to thank Carla, Professor Carla Brothers, for moderating this discussion. And I want to tell folks who are watching on Facebook, she's going to be having a class in fall that will focus on Black Lives Movement. And if you want more information, please follow her on her social media handles. And you can also check it out at utsa.edu. And I'll also request folks to, follow Kimia, Jonathan, and our commissioner so that we keep getting informed, and we want to ensure that we engage, that this is just not the end of the discussion. This discussion has been made possible by our community who help us by donating to Esperanza, and so I want to urge folks to you know, we're going through difficult times, to help us in donating, becoming monthly donors. And you can find more information on our Facebook page, esperanza.org. Please follow us on social media. And we will try as much as possible to make sure that we create platforms like this one where community discussions are ongoing. Thank you so much. And I hope each one of you has a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity.
You're welcome.